with the Executive Director of the African Center for Security and Intelligence Praxis, at Praxis, David Africa, and Chris Biyela is the Chairperson of Peace Committee. He will be joining us a little later during this discussion. David, thank you for making time for us. From your assessment, is this country in a position that may see the recurrence of the riots we saw in 2021?
Hi, good afternoon, Clement. If we look at the sort of fundamental driver of violence,
but I can see second anniversary.
David, just apologies for that. We had some interruption. I think that's our second guest trying to join us. But you can just continue with the point you are making, David, around your own assessment of where things are. Are we in a position where we could in fact see that recurrence?
I think we are very much in the same position, Clement, than we were 2 years ago. If we remove the proximate cause of the violence, which was the arrest of former President Zuma, and we look at, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why would a substantial number of South Africans who have benefited from this democracy engage in such a destructive and a widespread sort of orgy of violence? Then one has to look more deeply at things like the economy. You know, we have failed dismally to construct a new economy in the post-apartheid space. We somehow imagined and continue to imagine that we can take the old apartheid economy, which was constructed for a few people, for white South Africans, and just sort of, by giving it some color, transform the economy. But we've not constructed a new economy. So what this has done, if you look at the levels of unemployment, is that you have alienated poor black South Africans in particular from the economy, but also from the political system, because quite clearly, your vote as a poor black South African does not translate into any economic benefit, for the larger majority of our people. And that situation persists. We've not seen any fundamental shift in the last 2 years. So I would say the fundamental factors that could lead to a recurrence of what happened 2 years ago are very much in place. And all that it requires is a proximate fuse, something that will just create a spark. 2 years ago, it was the arrest of former President Zuma, but there are so many other issues that's just sort of waiting to explode in our country.
Yeah. Well, Chris Biyela is the Chairperson of the Peace Committee, also joining this conversation. Thank you for joining, Chris. From your assessment, David says, look, the conditions are still very much the same. So if there's a spark, we could easily be exposed to another incident like we saw in 2021. When it comes to law enforcement agencies, Chris, do you think the corrective measures have taken place, or are we exposed to that level of violence and the inefficiencies of our law enforcement agencies should we see a recurrence?
Yes, let me greet you and let me greet the gentleman next to you. Yes, I'll be honest with you, as South Africa, or particularly KZN, when it comes to the incident that happened in 2021, I can assure you that the government, or our government, has dismally failed to put in place or to establish those advanced measures to ensure that should it happen, such same incident, there will be a rapid response that will ensure the protection and the safety of our communities. by look of things, when it comes to security, I can tell you nothing has been done. Even when we come to things like social cohesion, which is very important, our government looks like they incapacitated in those things there.
Yeah. I mean, the growing seeds of discontent, the objective conditions which made the riots possible remain in place, as you said. David, I want to talk about the expert panel report now that had found that the police and intelligence services actually failed to do the necessary to protect the life and property. We were told that they were overstretched, they didn't have capacity, and I suppose what was even more concerning at the time of the expert panel releasing this report is that even at that time, there was not a lot that had been done since July to actually capacitate these security apparatus. Have we seen significant changes in our security institutions, David, with regards to the weaknesses that were flagged by the expert panel report?
Clement, I think, there's this concept that goes around and after July 21 and with the release of the expert panel report, the whole concept of intelligence failure, sort of became popular. I think what is important here is that when we think of intelligence, we are thinking of it as a system where you have intelligence institutions. I mean, in our case, the SSA, crime intelligence, defense intelligence, and you have clients of and consumers of intelligence. Now, the failure of the system cannot be attributed, as far as July 2021 is concerned, entirely to the intelligence institutions. Because the institutions produced some intelligence. I mean, we can argue about, how good it was and so on, but quite clearly something was reported. And you had failures on the policy side. Intelligence people are not creating policy. They are not constructing the economy. They are not responsible for ensuring social cohesion. So often what happens is that the national security institutions become an easy target for which to blame in these sorts of disasters, quite honestly. And others sort of get away scot-free, if we can use the term, without taking responsibility. Now, to come to the improvements in the national security community, in the institutions. I mean, the panel made a number of recommendations. It seems to me that some of these are being implemented. I mean, we saw with the EFF shutdown quite clearly a better level of coordination, which is a positive sign. We are seeing now, government presenting the new intelligence bill to reconfigure the intelligence community. But my own assessment is that many of these changes are quite artificial. They are not substantive because it is very difficult to construct, a new intelligence capability on the basis or without a national security strategy. So, I mean, one of the issues that came out of the report is that the lack of a national security strategy is a critical element in that failure. As we are talking here, 2 years down the line, we are no closer to having a national security strategy. I mean, normally that level of failure would result in the rapid development of such a national security strategy. And the question I'm asking myself is, how do we bring new bills to Parliament without a national security strategy? I mean, on what basis are we crafting this bill?
Yeah.
On what basis are we constructing new intelligence institutions, if not on the basis of a strategy? So I would say that clearly some things have been done or are being done as we speak, but I think that some of the fundamental issues remain unaddressed.
Chris, you have spoken to a lot of community members, I imagine during the unrest, even post the unrest. I mean, an incident like this leaves communities traumatized. How are the communities that were affected doing right now as we mark this second anniversary?
Well, all I can say is that a few of them are in a process of completely recovery from what had happened, but the majority of them, they are still remaining in trauma due to this lack of support, specifically by our government. We have been calling for. We have been calling for institutions such as social development to provide the victims with professional counselors, so it will assist them the process to digest and let go and relieve the stress and the traumas that is going through their head, their mind all the time. Also, I must tell you that some of them are still healing physically, because most of them, they were injured. So this incident it still remain as new to them, because each and every day they must live with these pictures in their mind. They must live with this mobility complications in their life. So I can just tell you that we are always disappointed how our government failed to support the victims in terms of healing process.
Yeah. David, let's talk about the issue of accountability. I mean, there was clearly poor oversight and poor consequence management, not only at national level, but you could argue at provincial, at local government level as well. Has there been accountability? Even the expert panel report said the executive carries some of the blame and must take responsibility for its lapse of leadership.
Well, Clement, you will recall that shortly after these events, as in several weeks thereafter, there was a cabinet reshuffle. I mean, if let's use the term accountability, this was the only action that was taken where the president effected a reshuffle, and that reshuffle happened to affect the security, at least defense and state security.
Yeah.
Now those were, accountabilities, if one can draw a link between the events themselves and the reshuffle. And I mean, the question, I mean, there were many questions raised at the times. For example, given the failure of the police themselves, why was there no reshuffling happening there? And so that is one issue. I mean, I think that, I mean, of more importance, because even the National Security Council was not convened in this time. And who is held accountable for that? The more important thing, I think, is really whether we have learned the right lessons, instead of trying to engage in a witch hunt and see who did or didn't do what. And to fix, what clearly were quite fundamental challenges at the time.
I suppose, David, we still don't know who the masterminds are. Does that sort of delay in the communities finding justice, the affected communities, just even the country moving forward? because some people were arrested, but these were not necessarily significant players. And I say masterminds because government led us to believe that there was a bigger project here. There are people that had actually properly planned this.
Yes. Look, you will recall that the president referred to an insurrection at the time. An insurrection, generally speaking, is a well-organized activity. You know, it's not just me, Clement, and Chris going out and causing chaos. Now, I mean, I don't know, and maybe you don't know because we are not inside these institutions, you know, who has been identified. But from what we see, you know, as observers of the situation, clearly there's not been the level of prosecution and conviction that is in keeping with the claim of an insurrection. Or with any sort of well-organized, widespread riots, if you want to call it that. It will help us to not forget that we are dealing with a police and law enforcement capability in general, police and prosecution, that lacks capability to conduct very sophisticated investigations. I mean, there's a reason why we have the high levels of crime that we do, why we are struggling to deal with organized crime, corruption, and so on. And you can't now magically expect the law enforcement agencies to become competent and capable on this particular issue. You know, it doesn't make sense. So I almost think that, again, like the issue of accountability, you know, the more important thing is to learn the right lessons and to build capability then. Because quite clearly, the fact that we've not seen these prosecutions. Yeah. I mean, prosecutions that make sense in the light of claims that were made around insurrections and so on. The lesson to learn is how do we build the capabilities so that next time this happens, you know, we are in a position to know in advance, firstly, and secondly, to prosecute people who are responsible for it.
Yeah. Chris, we are out of time, but just quickly, what are you as community organizations doing to re-establish that trust between community members and the businesses in the communities? Because when the riots started, these businesses were affected quite heavily.
Well, as a community leaders, particularly the victims leaders, all what we are trying to do in terms of to ease the tension between the communities and to stabilize the situation between the two communities. We are working closely with the institution of churches, where most of the time they come to see us, and then we create those programs that will ensure that unite us. We come together. Most of the time it's always about sports, because we believe that sports is neutral.
All right, Chris, thank you for making time. Chris Biyela and David Africa, thank you to both of you for joining us for this chat.